Subscribe and tap the bell. Twice a day, we bring you the real words of the Stoics, not paraphrased, not softened. Failure shows up constantly in Stoic writing, but almost never in the register modern advice usually reaches for. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius weren't interested in reassuring anyone that failure feels bad and will pass. They were interested in a narrower, more specific claim, that most of what people call failure is a misclassification, a mistake about which category an event actually belongs to before any judgment gets attached to it at all. Sorted correctly, a great deal of what feels like personal defeat turns out to be either information, a shared feature of the human situation, or evidence about something other than the person's own character. What follows are 5 distinct principles drawn from their writing, each addressing a different way failure gets misread, and each offering a different correction for it. The first principle is that a failure is information, not a verdict. Epictetus repeatedly frames outcomes as evidence to be examined rather than a judgment to be accepted wholesale. A plan that doesn't work reveals something true and useful, a wrong assumption, a gap in preparation, a factor that wasn't accounted for, and that revealed information is genuinely valuable, more valuable in some respects than a success would have been, since success rarely explains itself the way failure is forced to. Treating a failed attempt as a closed verdict on your worth or your prospects skips past all of that information in favor of a much simpler, much less useful story. The Stoic correction isn't to feel nothing about the setback. It's to extract what the setback actually reveals before deciding what, if anything, it proves about you. Epictetus applies this same standard to his own students, encouraging them to examine a bungled response to provocation the way a craftsman examines a flawed piece of work, not with contempt for the material, but with close attention to exactly where the error entered the process, since that's the only part of the failure actually useful for the next attempt. The second principle concerns the gap between effort and outcome, and the Stoics illustrated it with the discipline of archery. An archer trains carefully, aims with real skill, and releases the arrow, but a gust of wind, a flaw in the shaft, or 100 other factors outside the archer's control can still carry the arrow past the target. What can genuinely be judged is the aim, the stance, the discipline, the technique brought to the shot. Whether the arrow actually lands is a separate matter, decided partly by forces the archer never had authority over in the first place. Applied to any human effort, this principle relocates the real site of success or failure. The outcome was never fully yours to guarantee. The quality of the attempt always was, and it's the only part of the transaction a fair judgment can actually hold you to. This is closely related to the distinction Epictetus draws throughout his teaching between things that are genuinely up to a person and things that only look that way from the inside of the effort. An archer who trained badly and happened to hit the target has learned nothing true about their skill, no matter how the outcome flatters them. An archer who trained well and missed has lost nothing true about theirs, no matter how the outcome seems to embarrass them. Judging either archer primarily by where the arrow landed, rather than by the visible quality of the shot itself, gets the whole exercise backward. The third principle is that obstacles themselves become material for virtue rather than simple interruptions to it. Marcus Aurelius writes that what stands in the way of an action can, with the right response, become the way itself, that an obstacle to one plan often becomes the direct occasion for a different, equally real kind of progress, whether that's patience, resourcefulness, or plain endurance. This doesn't mean obstacles are secretly good or should be welcomed for their own sake. It means the value of a given moment doesn't disappear just because the original plan failed, since the obstacle itself supplies fresh material for the virtues that only ever get exercised under actual resistance, never in its complete absence. Marcus wrote this to himself while commanding armies through plague and a long, grinding war on the Danube frontier, circumstances that offered him no shortage of failed plans to test the principle against directly. A campaign delayed by weather, a strategy undone by disease moving through the camps faster than any enemy, none of it, in his account, cancelled the chance to practice patience, fairness to subordinates, or plain endurance under conditions nobody would have chosen. The obstacle changed what the day's task actually was. It didn't remove the possibility of doing that task well. The fourth principle narrows the question of defeat to where Epictetus insists it actually belongs, the will, not the world. External outcomes, a lost case, a missed promotion, a failed venture, sit outside a person's direct control by his own account, and can't be the site of a true defeat, since defeat in the fullest sense requires losing something that was actually yours to lose. What remains entirely yours, regardless of how any external contest resolves, is whether your judgment, effort, and character stayed sound throughout it. A person can lose a race while running it exactly right, and win one through luck they didn't earn. Epictetus's fourth principle insists these are not the same category of event, no matter how identical the outside world's language treats them. He pushes this further than most modern readers expect, arguing that even a person facing severe external loss, property seized, position stripped away, reputation ruined by someone else's lie, has not actually been defeated in the sense that matters most, provided their own judgment and will stayed intact throughout the ordeal. This isn't a claim that external loss doesn't hurt or doesn't matter at all. It's a claim about where the final scorecard is actually kept, and Epictetus insists, repeatedly, that it was never kept anywhere the world could reach. The fifth principle concerns what happens immediately after failure, and both men return to it often enough to suggest it mattered more to them than avoiding failure in the first place. Marcus writes to himself, in entry after entry, about catching a fault and correcting course without extended self-punishment attached to the correction, treating the return to sound judgment as the actual point, not the absence of any lapse at all. A person who never fails has no data on their own capacity to recover. A person who fails and returns promptly to the task has tested something a spotless record never gets to test. The fifth principle holds that a quick, honest return to the work matters more, in the Stoic accounting, than an unbroken streak ever could. Epictetus makes the same argument to his students in more procedural terms, telling them that a single failed attempt at self-command should be followed immediately by another attempt, on the same day if possible, rather than by a period of discouragement that only compounds the original lapse with a second, longer one. The discouragement itself, in his account, is a separate and more costly failure than the original mistake it followed, and entirely optional in a way the first one usually wasn't. Taken together, these 5 principles don't argue that failure is secretly painless, or that a Stoic simply reframes disappointment away through clever language. Marcus's own notebook is full of real frustration at his own repeated lapses, which means the frustration was genuinely there, not talked out of existence by principle alone. What the 5 principles change is what a given failure is allowed to mean once it's examined honestly, information rather than verdict, an outcome judged apart from the effort that produced it, material rather than mere interruption, a defeat confined to the will rather than smuggled in from the world, and a lapse followed by return rather than by collapse. None of that makes failure comfortable. It makes it usable, which the Stoics seem to have valued considerably more than comfort. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and the Stoics they trained, straight from the source, twice a day.